Next, FBI Director James Comey, Homeland Security Secretary Jay Johnson, and National Counterterrorism Center Director Nicholas Rasmussen testify about national security. This is 2 hours.
Morning, this hearing come to order. I want to first of all welcome our distinguished panel here, our witnesses. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your thoughtful testimony. Thank you for your service to this nation. When I took over chairmanship of this committee, was it about 10 months ago, the first thing I did is I reached out to Senator Carper, another person of real integrity, and I suggested we do something maybe a little unusual for a Senate committee. We developed a mission statement. I guess that's my business and my manufacturing background. And so we came up with one that's pretty simple. It's simply to enhance the economic and national security of America. I think that accomplished two things. First of all, it starts our relationship as a ranking member and chairman and as a committee on an area of agreement. I mean, who could disagree with that? It also directed the activity of our committee. And so the other thing we did is we established we've got really kind of two committees in one, Homeland Security and then Government Affairs. But on the Homeland Security side, and that's what this hearing's all about, we established some basic priorities. And not in any particular order, we established 5. Border security, cybersecurity, protecting our critical infrastructure, including our electrical grid, doing whatever we can to counter violent extremists, Islamic terrorists, whose threat, Director, in your testimony, you say is growing. And then our 5th priority was really kind of directed at the Secretary, but I'll include both you gentlemen as well. Doing everything we can, committing this committee to help you achieve your goal, your mission of keeping this nation safe. So again, I want to thank you for your service. It's exactly what this committee is trying to do. Your testimony, which I've reviewed, basically follows right down what our list of priorities are. These threats that we face in the nation are real. They're not diminishing. They're not receding. They're actually growing. And so I know you are, again, 3 men of integrity that take your duties and responsibilities very seriously. So again, I thank you for that. I'm certainly looking forward to your testimony. I want to thank the senators that are here. I'm looking for a very informative hearing. With that, I'll turn it over to Senator Carper.
Thanks so much, Mr. Chairman. I want to start off by sort of calling an audible here. I was thinking today, coming down, Secretary Johnson, coming down on the train, that in the last couple of weeks, we've been visited by Pope Francis up and down the East Coast, all over the place, millions of people involved, folks with him. We've been visited by the President of China, President Xi, big entourage. Up in New York City at the United Nations, I think leaders of over maybe 70 countries have visited our country, New York City, and the UN. The thing to me that's remarkable about all that, and I think you're going to touch on this in your testimony, but I want to just add a word as well. When the Secret Service screws up, and they have, we call them on it. And when people make a mistake, there needs to be accountability. I know you believe in that, and we do as well. And the Pope's visit of President Xi, the visit of all those 70 national leaders who came to our country, for it to come off without a hitch is just amazing. It's just amazing. And it gives me some encouragement that folks at the Secret Service, most of whom are hardworking, want to do the right thing every day, that better days lie ahead. They didn't do this by themselves. A lot of help from other entities within DHS, state and local law authorities and others. But I just want to say, as we say in the Navy, when somebody does a job well, bravo, Zulu. Bravo, Zulu. Since 9/11, the most, I guess, Acute terrorist threats came from Osama bin Laden. Today, bin Laden's dead. The core of al-Qaeda is largely dismantled. Fortunately, ISIS and al-Qaeda affiliates in Yemen and Syria have filled the void. The tactics they use against us and others have changed. ISIS in particular has perfected, as we know, using social media to spread its online propaganda and recruit members to its ranks. These new tactics mean that we can no longer rely on solely our military force to eliminate a terrorist threat. We must identify the root causes of why Westerners join the ranks of ISIS and tailor our counterterrorism tactics to meet this evolving challenge, and that's no easy task. To do this, we'll have to improve our ability to counter violent extremism, and I know we're focused on that. I know this is a priority for all of our witnesses. I commend the Secretary for establishing a new office at the Department that will be focused on countering violent extremism. Moreover, if we are to be truly successful in countering ISIS' message, among other things, we must remind the world of the principles and values that our country stands for. We have a long history of granting refuge to the war-weary. We have a moral obligation to continue this tradition by taking a reasonable share of Syrian refugees. The Pope reminded us, as he invoked not just the Golden Rule, but Matthew 25, when I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was naked, did you clothe me? When I was thirsty, did you give me to drink? When I was sick and in prison, did you come to visit me? When I was a stranger in your land, did you take me in? So there's a moral imperative here. It's a moral imperative for us not to be blind to this really awful situation that was faced by all these millions of Syrian refugees, but also to realize that there's a smart way for us to play a role. We're doing a huge role financially, leader among the nations of the world in providing aid, emergency aid to the folks that are displaced. And there's a sort of a tension here between how do we be consistent with Matthew 25, the least of these, and how do we do that in a way that protects us from extremists who might like to try to use this as an opportunity to come in and infiltrate our country. The other thing I want to mention is cybersecurity. I just came from meeting with a bunch of folks over in the Capitol on cybersecurity, and that when I finished my remarks, we took a little bit of time, and I said, everyone, if you take 15 seconds and tell us what you think we should make as a priority. What should be our priority between now and the end, say, Christmas? And they basically had two answers. One was, don't let the government shut down, come up with a reasonable budget, and that meets our nation's needs in a fiscally responsible, sustainable way. The other thing they said, cybersecurity. Cybersecurity. And we have the opportunity, we've worked very hard here under the leadership of our chair, a lot of folks on our committee, to do just that, to make it possible last Congress for DHS to have some of the tools that they need to do a better job. You are doing a better job. We applaud you for that. But to also make sure that we focus on information sharing, doing it in a smart way that incentivizes folks that are hacked or whatever to share their information with the federal government, and the federal government, in real time, it comes through the DHS portal in real time. You share it with everybody else, so there's no loss of time. So those are the kinds of things we're going to take Einstein, build on Einstein 1, 2, 3, Einstein 3A, put it on steroids, and I think you're doing a lot of good things in your department, Mr. Secretary, to help build on those tools. Last thing I want to say is this: a week ago, 2 weeks ago maybe, Senator Johnson and I were invited by you, along with Tom Ridge, former secretary, your predecessor, former governor, with whom I served as governor. And you invited us to come to Shanksville, Pennsylvania. It was a day I will never forget. And I just want to thank you again for that. It reminds us again of what can happen. When bad people want bad things to happen in our country, we have to be on guard. We have to be ever vigilant. But it also reminds me of the strength and the courage of the 40 people on that plane who refused to go down without a fight. Refused to go down without a fight. And I will always remember them, be grateful to them, and grateful to you for reminding us on that special day of what service is really about and what the values of this country are truly about. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Carper. I'd also like to thank Secretary Johnson for inviting us. The moment that stuck out in my mind, and you gave a great speech, everybody did, was when they're describing what those passengers did. Almost their final act was they did something quintessentially American. They took a vote. So I would recommend anybody who hasn't gone to Shanksville, most people probably haven't, go there. There's a powerful panel there where we've got phones where you can listen to 3 amazing voicemail messages from the people on that plane, concerned far more about their loved ones they're leaving behind than themselves. So again, something quintessentially American. With that, it is the tradition of this committee to swear witnesses in, so if you all rise and raise your right hand. You swear the testimony you will give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God. Yes. Thank you. Our first witness is Secretary Jay Johnson. Secretary Johnson is the fourth Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. Prior to leading DHS, Secretary Johnson served as General Counsel for the Department of Defense, General Counsel of the Department of the Air Force, and Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. Secretary Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you and Senator Carper noted, last month, the three of us attended a sobering ceremony in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, for the 14th anniversary of 9/11. Today, 14 years after 9/11, it is still a dangerous world. The events of 9/11 were the most prominent and devastating example of terrorist attacks by those who are recruited, trained, and directed overseas and exported to our homeland. The 9/11 hijackers were acting on the orders from al-Qaeda's external operations chief, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was in turn carrying out the direction of Osama bin Laden. Likewise, the attempted shoe bomber in December 2001, the attempted underwear bomber in December 2009, the attempted Times Square car bombing in May 2010, and the attempted package bomb plot in October 2010 were all efforts to export terrorism to the United States, and they all appear to have been directed by a terrorist organization overseas. The response to these types of attacks and attempted attacks on our homeland was and is to take the fight directly to the terrorist organizations at locations overseas. But today, the global terrorist threat is now more decentralized, more complex, and in many respects harder to detect. The new reality involves the potential for smaller-scale attacks by those who are either homegrown or home-based, not exported, and who are inspired by, but not necessarily directed by, a terrorist organization. Today, it is no longer necessary for terrorist organizations to personally recruit, train, and direct operatives overseas and in secret, and export them to the U.S. to commit a terrorist attack. Today, with new and skilled use of the Internet, terrorist organizations may publicly recruit and inspire individuals to conduct attacks within their own homelands. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula no longer hides the fact that it builds bombs. It publicizes its instruction manual in its magazine and publicly urges people to use it. Today, we're also concerned about foreign terrorist fighters who are answering public calls to leave their home countries in Europe and elsewhere to travel to Iraq and Syria and take up the extremist fight there. Many of these individuals will seek to return to their home countries with the same extremist motive. The recent wave of terrorist attacks and attempted attacks here and in Europe reflect this new reality. The Boston Marathon bombing in April 2013, the attack on the War Memorial in the Parliament building in Ottawa in October 2014, the attack on the Charlie Hebdo headquarters in Paris in January 2015, the attempted attack in Garland City, Texas in May 2015, and the attack that killed 5 U.S. service members in Chattanooga, Tennessee in July 2015. What does this recent wave of attacks and attempted attacks have in common? They're all conducted by homegrown or home-based actors, and they all appear to have been inspired and not directed by al-Qaeda or ISIL. We're concerned about domestic terrorism in the form of a lone wolf, which can include various aspects of domestic terrorism, such as right-wing extremism as well. We devote substantial efforts to the study and understanding of these threats, and will continue to further our understanding of the underpinnings of terrorist threats of all forms. What we're doing about it, I hope to discuss in further detail during the Q&A. It's set forth in my prepared remarks, and I will not elaborate that here. What I will conclude by saying is basically 2 points. One, I applaud both the House and the Senate for the good work that has been done on cybersecurity legislation. I applaud the fact that it has been bipartisan. As Senator Carper noted, I believe that there is an urgent need for help from this Congress in the area of cybersecurity. The need for cybersecurity legislation has, in my judgment, been amply demonstrated just over the last 12 months with some of the things we have seen. So I hope that the House and Senate can come together, pass legislation, go to conference, and have that legislation become law. The last thing I'll say is that Homeland security is part of national security. It is the front line of national security. Our job is much more difficult to protect the American people if Congress does not repeal sequestration. We simply cannot deliver for the American people all of the Homeland security that they need and want if we have to work with a sequestered budget. So I urge Congress, in as strong a terms as I can, to consider repealing sequestration. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Johnson. I will say I continue to press leadership to bring cybersecurity on the floor of the Senate. I think we have that commitment. I think you'll see that hopefully within the next couple of weeks. And success of that will largely depend on us all working together as we have in the past. It is amazing what you can accomplish if you concentrate on what you agree on, the things that unite us as opposed to exploit our divisions. So cybersecurity is certainly one of those things that we do agree on, and I'm actually quite hopeful of it, again, with your help and with Senator Carper's and really everybody on this committee. Our next witness is Director James Comey. Director Comey is the Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Director Comey has also served as the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, Deputy Attorney General for the Department of Justice, and General Counsel for organizations in the private sector. Director Comey.
Thank you, Chairman Johnson, Senator Carper. Thank you for this opportunity to appear before the committee, especially with my two friends and colleagues here with whom we do so much work to try and protect the American people. I'm grateful for their partnership. I'm not going to repeat what's in the written statement, which we've submitted for the record, and I think Jay has captured well the challenge we face. His description of a new reality is dead on, and I simply want to amplify it because it bears stressing. A lot of us are still thinking about the terrorism threat through the paradigm of what I call your parents' al-Qaeda. And I think it's very important the American people understand how things have changed. And so I just want to spend a brief minute on that. ISIL has broken the core al-Qaeda paradigm by using social media to broadcast a twin-pronged call to thousands and thousands of followers around the world, including many, many people in the United States. They send two messages. First, come to the caliphate and participate in the final battle between good and evil on God's side and find meaning in your life. Second, if you can't travel, kill where you are. Kill anyone, but especially if you could kill people in military uniform or law enforcement uniform and video it, that would be best of all. And it's a message that comes in an entirely new way because it buzzes in the pockets of troubled souls, unmoored people all over this country all day long. Twitter's worth a lot of money because it's a great way to sell shoes or books or movies. It's a great way to crowdsource terrorism. And so ISIL started investing in this in the middle of 2014, and earlier this year we saw the payoff on that investment in hundreds of investigations in all 50 states of people who are on some path between consuming this poison and responding to it by either traveling to the so-called caliphate or killing where they are. And so the challenge we face, the folks at this table, is finding those needles in a nationwide haystack and assessing where are they on that spectrum between consuming poison to acting on poison and disrupting them before they act. And it gets harder still. Right? It's not just a nationwide haystack where we're looking for needles, but what ISIL's been doing over the last year is when they find a live one, someone who might be willing to kill where they are, they will move them off of Twitter, where with lawful process we can see the communications, and move them to an end-to-end mobile messaging app that's end-to-end encrypted. So the needle that we may have found disappears on us once it becomes most dangerous. And with a court order, which is the way we collect the content of communications in the United States, we get a court order, we cannot see what's being said between that ISIL recruiter and someone who would kill where they are. This is a big problem. It is an illustration of the problem that we call going dark. It illustrates to people the conflict that we're experiencing in this country between two values we all hold dear, safety and security on the internet, right? I can assure you, Secretary Johnson and I are big fans of strong encryption. It protects what matters to us most. We must use strong encryption. But the other value that's in conflict is public safety. We must protect the people of the United States. We must find those needles and stop them before they kill. We must find child predators. We must find kidnappers. We must find drug dealers. Those two values we hold dear are crashing into each other. I don't know what the answer is, but as I keep telling folks, the FBI is not an alien force imposed on America from Mars. We belong to the American people. Our tools are only those tools the American people give us through you. And I think my job is to tell folks when one of the tools you're counting on us to use to protect you is not working so much anymore, we have to talk about that. And so there's been a lot of conversation, very productive. The administration has decided not to seek a legislative remedy now, but that it makes sense to continue the conversations that we're having that are very productive. Because here's the thing, people in industry are good folks. They share those same values, and they are working with us to figure out, so how could we solve this problem? And so we're talking to industry, we're talking to state and local law enforcement, we're talking to our foreign partners, because everybody who cares about these two values has to be involved in this conversation. There's no clear answer. An important start is to remove the venom and understand we share values. We care about protecting people. We care about safety and security on the internet. How do we maximize both values? It's a really hard thing, but I think America does hard, especially when it implicates our most fundamental values. So I thank the members of this committee for their engagement on this issue and my partners here at the table, and we'll continue the conversation with the American people. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Director. Our next witness is Director Nicholas Rasmussen. Director Rasmussen is the Director of the National Counterterrorism Center, NCTC. Director Rasmussen previously served as the Deputy Director of NCTC in various functions on the National Security Council staff and in several key positions within the Department of State. Director Rasmussen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator Carper. Like Secretary Johnson and Director Comey, I welcome the opportunity today to have a good, thoughtful conversation with the committee. Before getting into the threat picture in a little greater detail, I first want to stress just how well and closely aligned we at NCTC are with my colleagues at DHS and FBI. We see the threat environment the same way. We share information. We collaborate in a very intense way every day to produce analysis to support our operations. I'll start with the good news. From an analytic perspective, the chances of a spectacular large-scale attack here in the homeland carried out by an overseas terrorist group along the lines of what my two colleagues described, that has been substantially reduced over the last several years. And we've collectively achieved that outcome through aggressive CT action in South Asia and other places around the world, but also through the creation of a robust homeland security and counterterrorism infrastructure here in the homeland that we've developed as a community over the last decade. And while we can look with some degree of satisfaction at the work done to reduce that threat of a large-scale mass casualty attack, there's still quite a bit to be concerned about in the threat landscape, as Secretary Johnson and Director Comey mentioned. And that landscape is in some ways more challenging than ever. It's also clear that the terrorist operating paradigm has shifted, and it has shifted in ways that are proving particularly challenging as we try to identify and disrupt threats to the homeland. Today, there are more threats originating in more places and involving a more diffuse and disparate set of individuals than at any time previously. And let me spell out what I mean by that and highlight a couple of areas of greatest focus and concern. And as you would expect, I'll start with ISIL, the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant. In our judgment, ISIL has overtaken al-Qaeda as the leader of the global violent extremist movement, and the group does view itself as being in conflict with the West. And that conflict is being played out not just in Syria and Iraq now, but also in a number of other locations around the world where ISIL has declared itself to establish a province. Those places include Algeria, Libya, Egypt, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, Nigeria, the Caucasus region, and even potentially in Southeast Asia as well, Indonesia and perhaps the Philippines. And that aggressive growth and expansionist agenda has implications for our homeland threat picture. And there are three especially concerning features of ISIL as a terrorist group that make me reach this conclusion. The first is ISIL's extensive access to extensive resources, and that can be measured in terms of manpower, military materiel, and of course money. The second concerning feature of ISIL is the territorial control that ISIL exercises in large portions of Iraq and Syria, as well as in some of those province areas that I mentioned a few minutes ago. And third is their access to a large pool of individuals from Western countries, both those who have traveled to Iraq and Syria and those who have remained in their home countries. And when we look as intelligence professionals for indicators of external operations capability in ISIL that could threaten our homeland, These are the key features that we would expect to see, and that's of concern. And in his testimony, in his published testimony, Secretary Johnson alluded to how we are coming to view the threat from ISIL, and especially the Homeland piece of that threat. We're seeing that threat as having ISIL involved in some ways along a spectrum of activity. At one end of that spectrum, we see isolated individuals, as Director Comey mentioned, who draw inspiration from ISIL's prolific, spectacular use of sophisticated social media. And that's true even if ISIL isn't actually directing or guiding their actions. And at the other end of the spectrum, we assess that there are, in fact, individuals who may, in fact, receive direct guidance and direction from ISIL members, including people who are leaders in the ISIL organization. This spectrum is very, very, very difficult for us to penetrate and understand because of the collection difficulties that Director Comey pointed to a minute ago. But more often than not, we see that individuals inside the Homeland actually are operating somewhere between the two ends of that spectrum. And that creates a fluid picture that makes it even more challenging for us to get inside of. Beyond our intensive focus on ISIL and the threat it poses to the Homeland, though, you would certainly expect that we are continuing to devote substantial attention to al-Qaeda, its affiliates and nodes around the world. And despite the unrelenting media attention that is focused on ISIL in current days, in no respect at all would we downgrade our level of effort and attention on the al-Qaeda-related set of threats that we face as a nation. And when I'm asked often to identify what my #1 terrorism concern is, I most often decline to answer, because I wouldn't want to suggest that our focus on ISIL comes at the expense of efforts focused on al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations. Specifically with al-Qaeda, we're watching closely for signs that their attack capability is being restored ahead of the drawdown in Afghanistan. And while al-Qaeda's core leaders have certainly been degraded, we continue to track and investigate any indications that core al-Qaeda is engaged in plotting activity aimed at the Homeland. We know that that remains an ambition and their intent, so we stay on it constantly. In both their statements for the record, both Director Comey and Secretary Johnson highlighted al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and that's for good reason. The threat from AQAP remains at the top of our list of analytic priorities, given the group's unrelenting focus on targeting U.S. interests, including potentially the Homeland and potentially the aviation sector. Our work in this area is made all the more complicated by the difficult situation in Yemen at this time. Beyond Yemen, we're also watching al-Qaeda affiliate networks and individuals in Syria who may be looking to carry out external operations attacks. Our efforts to disrupt al-Qaeda plotting emanating from Syria have certainly been successful in the last several months, and some of the most important figures of concern have been taken off the map, but there's clearly more to be done in this regard. And in the meantime, we're looking very, very closely for any signs of intelligence that would give us a hint as to what they are planning. The third and final area of priority focus is the growing use of simple, opportunity-driven attacks by homegrown violent extremists, referred to as HVEs. If you go back to 2009, we were seeing on average less than 2 or 3 of these incidents a year. By last year, the number rose to 12, and to date this year, that number has already doubled, and of course, we're not all the way through the year yet. And while it's difficult for us to put numbers on the precise population of homegrown violent extremists here in the United States, there's no question in my mind that this population has increased in size dramatically over the last 18 months. And you could certainly say that ISIL has injected new energy and life into the population of homegrown violent extremists. ISIL, for its part, knows that it can have an impact, as the director said, by motivating individuals in their own locations to act in support of ISIL by carrying out individual attacks, even on a relatively modest scale. So as I conclude, I would just like to say that we stress again, we continue to work to detect, defeat, and disrupt the full spectrum of threats we face as a country, focused heavily on ISIL and the set of associated threats, but just as ardently, just as committedly on the focus remains on al-Qaeda and all of its affiliates. I'll stop there, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Director Rasmussen. Obviously, the purpose of this hearing is to highlight these threats so that as a public we face this new reality, as Director and Secretary both mentioned. Obviously, we want to be very concerned about anything classified, but it is extremely important. You know, Secretary Johnson, in your testimony, said, and let me repeat, but today the global terrorist threat is more decentralized, more complex, in many respects harder to detect. Director Rasmussen, your testimony, the array of extremist actors around the globe is broader, wider, and deeper than any time at 9/11. Director Comey, we had a hearing called Jihad 2.0, really exploring and highlighting the problem of and the sophistication with which ISIL is utilizing social media. In that hearing, we had testimony that said that there were, at the time, somewhere between 46 and 90,000 overt ISIS support accounts. Now, I know Twitter has been taking some of those accounts down, but they just, basically pop up with another name, another handle. You talked about the social media, those individuals following ISIS there, then being moved over into encrypted accounts. Can you give us some sense of the numbers of people that you're concerned about that have been engaged in social media? And I do want to talk about your inability to track, but how much information do we have just in terms of the number of people that have been inspired through the social media, the open media, where we can track, into encrypted accounts?
Probably the best number I can give in an open setting is dozens. Yeah.
Okay. I would also, as long as I'm talking to you, and I know Secretary Johnson has also gone into the communities to try and engage the communities. And I know, and this is, I don't think, classified. I remember hearing in a briefing that the members of the communities themselves think that we've got a complete handle on this, that we know who among their midst might be being inspired by ISIS, which that's completely false. Correct? I mean, is that, would you agree that that's sort of an assessment?
I do. First of all, I agree with you. I think Jay has been a leader on this, getting out there and talking to the good folks, no matter what their background, don't want their sons and daughters either going to the caliphate, which is a nightmare, and dying there, or killing people and surrendering their life to a long prison sentence here. The answer is, it's a huge challenge because good people do what good people do, which is we tend to write an innocent narrative over troubling facts. So the hair stands up on the back of your neck, but you say, well, I must be misunderstanding, or he must just be having a bad day, or I must not have heard him right. And what we're trying to get folks to do is, when the hair stands up on the back of your neck, just tell us, right? Tell any police officer, any deputy sheriff, we will check it out in secret so no one gets smeared. And if it's nothing, it's nothing. But if it's something, you may have just saved your child's life and the life of innocent people. But given human nature, that is an enormous challenge for us.
There was a New York Times article that really described an FBI informant operative really having multiple, I think hundreds of conversations with the terrorists from Garland, Texas. And the FBI had spent quite a few, I think hundreds of thousands of dollars for that FBI operative. Talk to me about the effectiveness of that. I mean, I'm just putting myself in the position of a parent whose son, maybe a 20-year-old kid, is being engaged with by the FBI, talked about different, the caliphate and all that type of thing, and then all of a sudden the FBI swoops in and says, did you ever talk about traveling over to Syria? And a person's brought up in charges, convicted. I think that's a serious concern about, is that the best way to engage a community? And based on that, have we rethought that at all?
Well, we haven't rethought. We all agree, I think, that it's very important that we try to understand where are folks from this consuming to acting, make an assessment, and then take it very seriously, especially if they're moving towards acts of violence. And so we're going to continue that work. But knowing that we have to do that work, I hope should motivate the good parents of the United States. No one wants their children to go die in the nightmare that is this so-called caliphate, or have to be locked up because they violated the anti-terrorism laws of the United States. And so it's just another reason why good parents need to talk to us, need to know what their kids are doing. I mean, one of the challenges we all face as parents, I have 5 children, is there's a sense that you want to know where your child's going physically. Right? You want to know if your kid's going to hang out at the mall, but you don't have such a sense of where they are online, which is the entire world. And so what we keep saying to people is, when you see things that are troubling, help us engage and keep kids from getting to a place where they have to be locked up. We've done a lot of work, the 3 organizations at this table, to try and build capabilities. We call them off-ramps, so that if we can intervene early, when a parent tells us about a kid, we can get that kid the help they need. Sometimes it's substance abuse, sometimes it's counseling, sometimes it's religious guidance, so they don't have to become somebody we have to lock up. And so that's an ongoing conversation with the families of the United States. And we're making progress, but it's something we got to continue to push on.
Secretary Johnson, again, you've been a real leader in engaging the communities, and I applaud you for that. And again, I'm a little concerned about numbers, but I will say I'm surprised if it is only a couple dozen People have been inspired in social media and then moved into encrypted accounts. Do you, I mean, talk to me about your engagement with communities, but also about that, your assessment of that number.
Well, first of all, by the nature of the existing threat we face, we are concerned about a lot of people who self-radicalize, essentially, by reading things on social media without necessarily direct communications between somebody in the homeland and somebody overseas. And what we know suggests that before somebody in that situation turns to an act of violence, there are very, very few people who are in a position to know about it. The parents, perhaps, a brother, a spouse, somebody that is living in the immediate home with that person. And so by the nature of the problem, we don't often have advance opportunity to interdict, to arrest, to prosecute, which is why I think the CVE engagements are so important, to build bridges, lower barriers of suspicion, and encourage people in communities, this is your homeland too, help us help you with public safety. And so we've been out there doing this. I think we've seen a lot of good reaction, some criticism to our efforts, which I think means we know our efforts are having an effect. But just heightening awareness and asking people for their help is fundamental given the nature of the current threat we have.
Just real quick with Director Rasmussen, Director Comey talked about the balance, the very delicate balance between civil liberties and security, and we're always concerned about that. You talked about spectrum. Where are we today in that spectrum, in that fulcrum point between civil liberties and security, and where do we really need to be?
Boy, that's an incredibly complex question, and I'm not sure there's a particular point that that is a resting point on that spectrum. As Director Comey suggested, we know we are facing significant new challenges in the way we have traditionally collected intelligence to get at our terrorist adversaries. Simply put, the kinds of insight we used to have into some of the more complex al-Qaeda-linked plotting is just not available to us right now. And so naturally, in that environment, we're going to exhaust every opportunity we can, every avenue we can think of to try to develop new collection opportunities. Those will, of course, have to be balanced against all of the factors you described, Mr. Chairman. And that's an ongoing process, which is why I don't think we are at some steady equilibrium along a spectrum. I think this, as the Director said, is also going to be a subject of an ongoing conversation with the private sector and the parts of industry that hold critical nodes of communication. And unfortunately, many of these terrorist actors are exercising their craft on these platforms. I think the good news is that we have opened a conversation. There's a lot of ground to be covered in that conversation without the federal government dictating solutions or as the Director said, choosing a legislative framework at this particular point. But we're at the front end of that conversation, and it has to play out over the period ahead.
I recognize it's complex. I didn't expect a definitive answer, and it's exactly, your answer is exactly right. This is a conversation, this is a discussion we must have. It has to be an honest conversation, and we have to be looking at the new reality, the threats we're facing. They're not on the run, they're growing, and we need to be concerned about that, and we got to be discussing this in a very serious and honest fashion. Senator Carper.
Let me preface my questions by again just emphasizing how much we appreciate your commitment to our country, your commitment to defending us, and the hard work that you and your team, the teams that you lead, are doing on our behalf. I like to talk, as my colleagues know, I like to talk about what is the secret to a long marriage between two people, and best answer I ever heard: communicate and compromise. I'd add a third C to that: collaborate. And when I look at the three of you, I see the three C's: communicate, compromise, collaborate, embodied. So keep it up, and thank you. You set a good example for us. Our chairman and I and others on this committee like to focus not just on addressing symptoms of problems. We're pretty good at that as a nation. We don't always look at the underlying cause or the root cause. Well, Senator Johnson and I are going to lead a CODEL. I think Senator Peter's going to go down with us. I think Senator Heikamp's going down with us. I think some of our, maybe a couple of House colleagues are going to go down with us. And we're going to go to Honduras, maybe Guatemala, and try to get a better handle on why tens of thousands of people would risk life and limb to go 1,500 miles through a terrible situation, getting through Mexico to get to our border to face an uncertain future. We spent $1 trillion in the last decade or so trying to figure out how to stop people from getting in. We spent less than 1% of that to try to figure out what the root causes are that are compelling people to come. So I'm a big root cause guy. And when I look at the cyber attacks that have been directed at our country in recent years, one of them is Chinese. And the state, and they know what's going on. They pretend that they haven't, but they know full well that there are entities within that country. They're trying to steal our intellectual seed cord to be able to get economic shortcuts to prosperity at our expense, and we just pretty much underwrite the costs for them. I just want to commend Secretary Johnson and everybody else that was involved, the President and others that were involved in convincing the Chinese that it was time to change their ways, to mend their ways. And I'm not sure what the prospects are for actually succeeding in this, but the agreement that's been struck is a very, very encouraging sign. I really didn't think we'd be able to get that, so I applaud you. There's a mechanism in place, Secretary Johnson, going forth. I think it involves you. I think it involves the Attorney General to build on what's been agreed to make sure that it's not just that they're going to say this and do something else. How do we make sure they do what they have committed to do, and for us to build on that? Would you just talk a minute about that, please?
Yes. When the Chinese were here, both for the President's visit and about 2 weeks before, we had very frank conversations about cybersecurity, about cyber norms that we believe nations should embrace. And there's a lot of good things on paper. The question now becomes whether the Chinese will do what they agreed to do on paper. And so the way forward will be putting them to the task of having ministerial level conversations with us on a regular basis. We hope to have one before the end of this year. And we're now arranging dates to do that. So time will tell about whether or not the Chinese will live up to what they agreed to do. I'm pleased with what is on the paper, but actions will speak louder than words in this context.
All right, thank you. I alluded earlier to actually the Pope's message, Pope Francis' message to us when he was here and spoke to our joint session of Congress a week or two ago, and his focus on the Golden Rule and on Matthew 25, the least of these. And one of the provisions in Matthew 25 talks about, where were you when I was a stranger in your land? You know, did you welcome me in? And we have, I think, a moral obligation to do that where we can and to look out for those that are in terrible situations. We have this need to make sure that as those 10,000 Syrian refugees come to our country, that they're not embedded by a number of folks from ISIS that wish us harm. And I'd just like for us to talk about what we can do, ought to do, will do, to the extent that you can in a public forum, to make sure that those threats are anticipated and appropriately addressed. And that could be for a number of you, Mr. Comey, Director Comey, Secretary Johnson, Nick.
Well, just to highlight one thing in particular, given the nature of how the terrorist threat has evolved, I think it is incumbent upon us at the federal level to share as much intelligence as we can with state and local law enforcement. I think Jim's people do an excellent job at the federal level of detecting, investigating, and interdicting terrorist threats almost on a weekly, if not daily basis. And I've been constantly impressed with how their methods have evolved to match the threat. But things like the Garland City, Texas attempted attack highlight that it's also critical that we get information out to state and local law enforcement as well, so that they're aware of what we're seeing.
Mr. Comey.
With respect to the potential of Syrian asylees coming to the United States, there's
a real tension here, as you know. We're trying to do the right thing, and by the same time, we're trying to do the other right thing.
It is something that we have learned had to do better screening people. The experience we had, we didn't do it as well as we should have in the mid-2000s, the first decade with Iraqi refugees. So we had to go back and redo it. We've learned a lot from that. So I think we are more effective as a law enforcement, intelligence, national security community at screening folks. That said, there is no such thing as a no-risk enterprise, and there are deficits that we face. I'm not comfortable talking about them in an open setting. I don't want the bad guys to know what we might not be able to do.
I understand.
But that's how I'd sum it up.
All right, fine. Thank you.
Senator, if I could.
Please. Yeah.
With regard to Syrian refugees in particular, I agree totally with what Jim said. We should do the right thing by accepting more, but we've got to be careful in doing it. We have improved the process for vetting, from a security standpoint, the refugees who are admitted in this country, and I'm committed to making sure that we maintain that process.
Good, thanks. Director Comey, you mentioned encryption, backdoor ways to make sure we're trying to protect against terrible crime and criminals. And you mentioned conversations are underway. Can you tell us just a little bit more about that? Because this is real important, and I'm sure you do too.
We're having increasingly productive, frankly, conversations with industry, because I think in part the ISIL threat focused everybody's minds and understood that we're just not making this up, right? That there really is a conflict between values we all care about, safety and security and public safety. And so industry is not a monolith. There's lots of different services and products being provided. But what I have found is they're all people who care about the safety of America and also care about privacy, civil liberties. And so we're talking to each other about, so how could we accommodate both of those values? Again, this is about how could we get you in a position to comply with a court order? We're not looking for volunteers, not looking to sneak in anywhere, but how could we get to a place technologically, legally, where we could get you to comply with court orders? So that's with the companies, but also really important conversations with our allies around the world who care both about the same values, right? The rule of law and care about safety, public safety. And so we're having good conversations with a lot of our European allies, but how could we together come up with a framework that would make sense, embrace the rule of law, and maximize both of those values. And then the last group was state and local law enforcement. I mean, this is actually a problem that affects state and local law enforcement most of all, because child abuse cases, domestic violence cases, car crash cases, all of those things that cops and sheriffs and DAs have to work are affected by the fact that encryption has gone from an option available to sophisticated people, which has always been, to a default. And so cops and sheriffs trying to figure out where this child went are increasingly encountering devices they can't open with a search warrant. And so we're engaging them in the conversation too, because this affects every community in the United States. There's no simple answer, but it is, that's what I meant when I said the conversations are ongoing and they've gotten healthier because people have stripped out a lot of the venom. Folks aren't questioning as much as they used to each other's motives because we're at a place where we recognize we care about the same stuff.
I'll close with this quick note if I can. We're always asking Secretary Johnson, what can we do to help? What can we do to help? He's always good to give us a to-do list. I would say to you, this is an important issue, and if there's some things that we can be doing to help on the legislative side, please let us know.
Thank you, Senator Carper. By the way, a quick comment, suggestion on the prioritization of the Syrian refugees we do let into this country. If we set as a #1 criteria family members, and we can do DNA testing, that would certainly be, I think, helpful. Plus, Syrian families, Syrian American families can also be financially responsible. So I think it's setting criteria for prioritization of who we actually let in. I think it would be helpful. Senator Tester.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you all for your sobering testimony. I'm going to start with you, Director Comey, and the ranking member touched on it about folks being on Twitter and then they go dark. And you talked about technology and legality, and you talked about working with the private sector when you responded to the ranking member. The question I have is, do you have adequate resources? This could go across the board, by the way, because I know you work on it too, Jay. But do you have adequate resources? Do you have adequate manpower to be able to technologically stay ahead of these guys?
A tentative yes, and here's why it's a tentative yes. The answer yes depends upon a number of things. The FBI's ability to hire out of the hole we were left with from the impact of the last sequestration. Right? Yeah. Almost 3,000 vacancies. We're climbing out of that hole now. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, I don't know whether what we face this summer is the new normal. That is, this summer we were following dozens and dozens of people all over the United States 24/7. And that's only easy on TV. And so to do that, we had to surge resources from our criminal cases to make sure we covered this so these folks didn't go kill people. And we disrupted a lot of those people. And our great colleagues in the military have made some progress at degrading some of the capabilities of ISIL in their so-called caliphate. So I don't know whether what we experienced this summer will be the new normal. If it is, then I will have a resource mismatch, and I'll be prudent about coming back and asking.
Okay. Jay, is your agency in the same boat?
Yes, I agree with everything Jim said, and I also agree with his assessment of the going dark problem.
Yeah.
There are demonstrable cases where we've seen that our ability to track individuals of suspicion is hampered by the means of their communication.
And so I was just asking, can technology take that darkness to light?
With help from the private sector, yes.
Okay. Collaboration, communication has been talked. I think it was you, Nick, talked about across the board. You guys collaborate and communicate well. How's it working with state and local law enforcement? Are they brought up to speed, or are you concerned about information getting out that you don't want out, so they're not brought up to speed? Give me the lay of the landscape. I don't care which one you want to talk about.
I think it's in a very good place, and I think they would be the best people to check with on this, but I think our Joint Terrorism Task Forces, our fusion centers around the country are connected in ways they weren't before, and chiefs and sheriffs understand that the new reality, as Jay said, is not a Washington-focused or New York-focused. These troubled souls, these unmoored people are everywhere,
right.
And so they get that and they are engaged. And I think they would tell you that they are hearing earlier and more completely from all of us at this table what they need to know.
So the channels are there to flow information down and back up?
Yes.
Okay. The ranking member also talked about, he said, it takes more than military to reduce the terrorist threats. Would you guys agree with that statement?
Yes, absolutely.
And your role is in reducing the domestic threat. That's your primary responsibility, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So as Congress wraps up this year, and any one of you guys can answer this, but it'll probably be you, Jay, what would you prioritize Congress needs to do, the 2 or 3 things, for you to be able to do your job?
Repeal sequestration.
That we need to get done soon.
Repeal sequestration so that I can do all the things that the American public needs us to do for Homeland Security, whether it's cybersecurity, border security, aviation security. It is going to be very difficult to meet all of those priorities if we have to work with a sequestered budget.
Okay, get rid of sequestration.
That is
Anything
1, 2,
else?
and 3.
That's 1, 2, and 3, okay. Has there been any comparison with terrorist actions in this country and other countries in the world? Are we more targeted, or is it the same threats around the world? Go ahead, Nick.
The phenomenon that we've all described, these unmoored, untethered actors who potentially are connecting to ISIL by consuming their media and maybe seeking to act on their own, we have our concerning population of those individuals, as the director described, as we've all described. Our European partners have a much larger population of those potential actors, several of them quite a bit larger than ours. And so by relative comparisons on scale, I think we are, in a sense, better off than some of our close European partners. That by no means makes me feel sanguine about our own efforts and the level of resources, as the director indicated, to be able to follow and track all of the individuals who may turn out to be a concern from a terrorism perspective. But our European partners in some ways are even more challenged because they bring to the table often considerably less capability than we do, not just in their FBI equivalent or their Homeland Security equivalent, their Ministry of Interior or their domestic security service, but their whole counterterrorism and Homeland Security enterprise is often considerably less well-developed than ours, and they're often looking to us for help in trying to help figure that out.
And is that because they choose not to fund it?
Again, I think it's the rapid emergence of this new variant of the threat. I think they became, as would not be surprising, comfortable with their capability to deal with the kind of al-Qaeda threat and al-Qaeda affiliates as they understood it. The threat has changed in a pretty dramatic way, as we've tried to outline, and it creates a new set of challenges, some of which are particularly resource-intensive for law enforcement and intelligence organizations, especially in smaller countries.
This isn't within your purview, but is there anybody, it seems to me this, what's going on in the Middle East now, and it extends far beyond that, is crazier than I've ever seen in my lifetime, and I don't think that's an imagination. I mean, I think there's just stuff going on that makes no sense. Is there, at least from my perspective, it makes no sense. Is there anybody that's trying to find the root causes of why everything seems to be going upside down? You guys are dealing with the threat on this end. Is there anybody that's trying to ask the questions of why these guys are so effective? And I know it's communication, the internet and all that, but maybe there doesn't. Is there a root reason for this stuff? Is there something that's going on in the world that we could have some impacts on that would delegitimize these folks?
We could have a whole hearing on this. And you're right, it's not directly within the purview of the three of us. My immediate reaction to your question is that there needs to be more of a global message and a global theme to counter the ISIL message to the Muslim world about what the Islamic State supposedly represents. And so my judgment is that in order to try to counter what we're seeing, the volatility that we're seeing in the Middle East, particularly Iraq, Syria, is a more amplified global message about how, in the Muslim world in particular, their efforts and their energy should be directed toward younger people in a positive, constructive way.
Okay. Thank you all for the jobs you do.
Thank you, Senator Tester. By the way, Secretary Johnson, I agree with you. Sequestration was a really stupid idea, but there's a way of solving this, and it's called prioritization of spending. And I completely agree. Defense of this nation, defense of this homeland is a top priority, and we ought to treat it that way. Senator Ayotte.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to thank all of you for being here and for what you do to keep the country safe and for your leadership. And I wanted to start with a question for you, Secretary Johnson. We in New Hampshire are facing a public health epidemic with opioid and heroin abuse, and we've had a situation where we've had a 60% increase in drug deaths. And recently, Mr. Secretary, I know that you, thank you for reviewing the transcript of the hearing that we had, Senator Shaheen and I had in New Hampshire of this committee, which was where we had the CBP Commissioner Gil Kurlikowski there, we had the DEA Acting Administrator Jack Riley there, and Director Botticelli from the Office of National Drug and Control Policy. So they testified, but also we heard from the police chief of our largest city, Nick Willard. And Chief Willard said something that I think is really important that's right in your wheelhouse, which is they had an arrest recently. They responded to a shooting in Manchester, and they had officers go into an apartment unknown to us previously, these are his words, and we found it to be a drug house. And from that, we did an investigation that led to Lawrence, Massachusetts, and from Lawrence, Massachusetts, directly to Mexico. So now we know that there's a Mexican drug cartel, the Sinaloa drug cartel, that is fueling heroin to the streets of Manchester, New Hampshire, and that's alarming. I would agree with Chief Willard. We know this is coming over the Mexican border. It's really cheap on our streets right now. And obviously, this is a very complex problem. There's some very strong bipartisan legislation we're working on here across the aisle. But Secretary Johnson, can you tell me what more we need to do to interdict more drugs, especially heroin, coming over from Mexico? And how are you working with Mexican authorities on this issue and also other departments, including the FBI, DEA, because this really is a public health epidemic?
Well, first, Senator, thank you for conducting that field hearing. I found the testimony and your remarks from that enlightening. And you've put the spotlight on a serious problem in New Hampshire. From my perspective, interdiction is the key. Interdiction at the southern border is the key. And what we've done within my department is devise our Southern Border Campaign Strategy, which is a consolidated strategic effort to bring to bear all the resources of my department on the single problem of border security, which includes people and narcotics. So that's not just CBP, it's also Immigration and Customs Enforcement, HSI, and we are generally moving in the direction of a more coordinated strategy which includes the DEA and other elements of our law enforcement. Eventually, I'd like to do the same thing on the northern border so that we are less stovepiped in our approach to both borders. And my hope is that at some point the Congress will codify our southern border campaign strategy into law and give us the additional resources we need to further work on this effort. But obviously, interdiction is the key.
And Director Comey, I wanted to ask you, one of the things that we know that the people who are addicted, law enforcement's telling us, rightly so, we can't arrest our way out of this problem, but they want to focus on the kingpins, they want to focus on the cartels. We saw from Secretary Johnson what he just said, obviously the interdiction piece, but how's the FBI working to go after, for example, the kingpins of these enterprises that are really making the money off of it and providing, getting more and more people addicted, unfortunately, in our country?
The answer is working especially closely with DEA. Our strategy is focused on what we call transnational organized crime, so the big syndicates and the cartels, to do just what you said, to drive up the cost for them, to lock up them and their lieutenants, to make it harder for them to try to get drugs in, the interdiction being a separate piece of the strategy. And we're working hard at that every single day, but it is an enormous problem because of the shift you talked about.
Can I ask you, one of the issues that the chief raised and we talked about with the DEA, I just wanted to see if you had any insight on this. Chicago has an OCDEF model that they're working on, and I didn't know if the FBI understood was a part of that model, which really was bringing, so it has a sort of a partnership, as I understand it, DOJ, FBI, DEA, and local authorities. And our authorities were interested in, could we bring a similar model to work together along with the HIDTA task force in New Hampshire? And I just wanted to get your thoughts on that type of model.
Yeah, it's a model that we've, I can't remember what the nearest OCDEF task force is to New Hampshire, maybe one in Boston, I can't recall, but that's a huge feature of our work because drugs is not the Bureau's specialty, but we have certain capabilities that we can bring to bear, so we tend to bring it to bear in those task forces, which is both mostly OCDEF, actually, and also HIDTA's.
Well, I would ask you, because when I had Administrator Riley in New Hampshire, I would ask you, Director Comey, can you work with us on this? And Administrator Riley committed that from the DEA, too, to see, just to make sure, and I will say that Chief Willard said that he's been really pleased with the help he's getting from the FBI, but looking at, are there better ways we can do this and make sure we're all working together in a cohesive fashion?
Sure, thank you.
I appreciate that. I wanted to ask about this issue of, I know in your testimony, Director Comey, you've talked about the estimate that 250 Americans have traveled, I don't know if it's in Secretary Johnson or your testimony, have traveled or attempted to travel to Syria to participate in obviously the conflict, and we're worried about obviously their participation in the jihad. And one thing I wanted to ask about is, I understand, Director Comey, that we've had an effort where we've been arresting people across this country very aggressively. And as I understand it, we've had maybe close to 50 arrests that are related to these issues. Maybe the person didn't travel to Syria, but they have some connection where they're at least perhaps were attempting to travel, a connection to ISIS. Could you tell us what's happening? Because I think it's important for the American people to understand that this is happening quite frequently. Your department is trying aggressively, working with Homeland Security to arrest these individuals, but what have you been doing across the country in terms of arrests that are being made?
Yeah, we're trying to, the arrests are part of our strategy to do two things: to incapacitate people who might otherwise travel over to the so-called caliphate, and then become much more dangerous to us. I know some folks say, why don't you just let them all go? Maybe they'll get killed there. Well, maybe they won't. And when they've
We certainly don't want them coming back or,
Right.
or going to hurt our partners in
Right,
Europe.
and that's the future we're going to be talking about for the next 3 to 5 years. So we want to stop that, but we also want to send a really scary message because what we see in the travelers is they're getting incrementally younger, and more females think that it's a great way to find a life. So we're trying to send a message, first of all, that it's a nightmare there, especially for a woman, but that if you play around with this, you're going to end up in jail for a long stretch to try and change that behavior.
Could you give us a sense, I know my time's up, but who are you arresting? Like, what's the background of the individuals? You said more women. Are you encountering younger people? Is this just centered in one community, or is this something we're seeing across the country?
No, the challenge for us is there's no geographic center to it, and in part because of the crowdsourced way that the message is going out, and there are kids and adults who are seeking meaning in their life, troubled people all over the United States, and so it resonates with those groups. What I meant was we're seeing, there isn't a particular demographic, either it's the location or to age. The Syria travelers early on ranged from something like 18 to 63. But what we have noticed is, and it's early, so this isn't a high confidence read, it seems to be drifting younger with more girls. And by girls, I mean women under the age of 18, with whom this message on social media is resonating. And my hope is, and it's not just hope, I may see some early signs in the data that the message is getting out to families and to young people. First, it's a nightmare in Syria. Don't go there thinking.
Of course it's a nightmare. I mean, women are being raped. Girls are being raped. It's horrific.
It's hell on earth. And this isn't some joyride, right, that you will get in serious trouble if we get wind of it, and you will go to jail for a very long stretch. And we're doing, both of those things are important in driving the numbers down, but time will tell whether we're making progress there.
Well, thank you. And this is obviously something we're all very concerned about. Appreciate you all being here.
Thank you, Senator Ayotte. And again, thank you for your leadership on this heroin issue. If you remember during testimony in one of our Board of Security hearings, General McCaffrey said we're only interdicting 5 to 10% of illegal drugs coming in through the southern border, really indicating really how unsecure a border is. So, you know, I want to thank Secretary Johnson. By the way, we were talking about the border metrics bill. That report language will be done, I think, next week. So hopefully we can get that passed as a first step. And I'm happy to you know, we've been working on you know, helping you codify your strategy. So happy to ramp up those efforts and kind of work on those areas of agreement. So thank you for that. Senator Heitkamp.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So much to talk about in so little time. I want to thank you, Secretary Johnson, for mentioning the northern border. It's a big balloon. Press on one area, it's going to stress another area. Obviously, we have huge workforce challenges on the northern border, recruiting and retaining workforce. And so we've been working with OPM, working with your office, and I want to thank you for the attention that you're focused. Senator Ayotte and I have a bill that has already passed here and will hopefully require a new look at the northern border. So I'll leave it there. And Director, I don't mean to pick on you, but I'm going to. Have you ever been to Indian country, personally?
Yes.
Where?
I've been to Navajo, I've been to Acoma Pueblo, a couple other pueblos.
Okay. Have you ever been to a Great Plains reservation?
I have not.
Pine Ridge.
My children go to Pine Ridge every summer, so.
I want to tell you, there is no place in the United States where you have more responsibility in Indian country. And there is no place where we don't have a cop on the beat. We can talk all we want about what's happening in places like New Hampshire. When Gil was the drug czar, he came out and he spent 4 hours listening to the challenges of Native American leaders in dealing with drugs, cartels, an easy place to hide because jurisdictionally it's a no man's land and there is no cop on the beat. And a Native American woman said to him, "We are an endangered species." And we have huge and critical problems, and the FBI, I think, is failing in meeting the challenges, certainly in my part of the world, in protecting Native American people. We have record numbers of rapes of small children. We have record amount of drugs. 40%, a tribal chairman told me 40% of all the children born on one of my reservations is meth addicted. And so I'm begging you to help. I'm begging you to seek an opportunity to participate and to bring federal law enforcement and bring your counterparts at DEA and really start focusing. Because as we talk about the structures of law enforcement, and, you know, spent a lot of years, 8 years as North Dakota's Attorney General. When people said, you know, where is it that the FBI gets along with the rest of the states, I'd raise my hand. We have a terrific relationship with the FBI and local law enforcement, but we lose and we fail in Indian country, and you can't protect a whole state when you have a huge amount of land and a huge opportunity for people who are peddling poison to basically go undetected, invisible, and not even you know, any threat at all of prosecution right there on the reservation. And people who can move are moving, and people who can't move are being exploited. And so I'm wondering if within the FBI and within the Department of Justice and your counter agencies, whether there is an opportunity to really do more surge work in Indian country, especially in my part of the world.
The answer is yes, and thank you for that. It's not picking on me because I agree with you totally, and I'm so grateful for your passion, because I've had a bunch of meetings on this as director. My children, when I became FBI director, had just returned from Red Shirt Table, and my 2 girls said to me, "You've got to do something. You wouldn't believe what it's like." Well, I understand in a pretty good way what it's like, and I describe it as a crime scene without representation. No one speaks for these places, so to hear you speak for this, Senator, is a wonderful thing. So I've done some, not nearly enough. I've pushed additional resources to the Minneapolis Division, which covers you. I have changed the way we assign and recruit agents to Indian country to get more there and to get more talent there, but I have to do more. And so watch this space, but I'd love to talk to you about it again.
I would welcome the opportunity to talk about what we need to do, because if a lot of people don't understand jurisdictional challenges. I spent a lot of time trying to get MOUs so that we could get drug task forces, and this was back when we were worried about far less influx of white powder heroin. Methamphetamines is epidemic, and the challenges are not only in the public health arena, because Indian Health isn't equipped to handle this, but they're certainly in the law enforcement, and we need a cop on the beat. And that is the federal officials. You have primacy here. And so I look forward to working with you on those issues and making sure that this big part of my community, which is Native American people, have the same level of public protection as any other American. And right now, you know, I've got huge landmass, 1 cop, and a big river in between, and no way to get across the river to protect people. And so, and these challenges are in Alaska, they are in, as you said, on the Navajo. And so I want to thank you for your willingness to have this conversation. I want to tell you we are passionate about it. Senator Tester and I have talked over and over about this, and we would welcome you in North Dakota. Thank you.
Senator Portman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here and for your service. On the issue of opiate abuse, particularly heroin, which is the growth area in my state of Ohio and around the country, we now have the alarming statistic that in Ohio it's the #1 cause of death, greater than auto accidents, which is typically the case. I was able to speak at the rally on addiction that occurred on Sunday evening here, and then spent the week with some of the individuals who came in from Ohio. And I do believe that this is an epidemic level at this point, particularly in certain parts of our state. And by the way, the addiction rates in our rural communities are higher than in our urban or suburban communities now, according to the latest statistics that we have. And I focus more on the demand side and the treatment and recovery side. But law enforcement plays a critical role, and we need your help in Ohio. We do have some HIDTA programs that are working well, and I appreciate your commitment to that today. Switching gears for a second, Secretary Johnson, just over a week ago, you stated the threat of foreign terrorist fighters requires the comprehensive efforts of all of our partners, agencies, allied nations will continue to adapt to this evolving threat and take the necessary action to protect the American public. I would ask this morning, Director Rasmussen, if you could give us some information on these foreign fighters. And specifically, my concern is, of course, these visa waiver countries. Can you tell us how many foreign fighters from visa waiver program countries have traveled to Syria to date?
I'd have to get back to you with the breakdown by the visa waiver countries as we understand it, Senator, but in aggregate, we assess that if you go back to the period when the conflict began, well over 3 years now, and look in aggregate, the population of individuals who we assess have traveled to the conflict zone is upwards of 28,000 right now. Now, that is an aggregate, so it does not mean that today, as we speak, there is a pool or a population inside Iraq and Syria that captures and covers 3 years of activity. It also captures and covers activity in both directions. Individuals who've died on the battlefield, individuals who've come and gone, individuals who've left and gone to other onward third locations. From the West, and that would largely capture the visa waiver countries that you're talking about, Senator, we assess that population, that aggregate total, is somewhere in excess of 5,000, with the number of U.S. persons, as the Director indicated, being approximately 250. So that's the broad breakdown of the numbers as we have them. The greatest supplier countries come from the immediate frontline states in the region, as you would imagine, because travel is so easy. But then as you get into the next outer ring, which of course would include Southern and Western Europe, of course, the population numbers are significant there as well.
Yeah, that's a shocking number, 5,000. And just so people understand what we're talking about here, these are countries that have a visa waiver program with the United States where they can come to the United States without going through the normal process to get a non-immigrant visa. These are countries that are sending foreign fighters into Syria. The concern is they would then go back to their country of origin and then be able to come to the United States under a visa waiver. And 5,000 is obviously a huge number and a huge concern. If you wouldn't mind, what I'd like to do is ask you to get back to me on a more specific number from the visa waiver countries. And specifically, I have a concern about the lack of information sharing. And you know, we have programs with some of these countries where we try to share information, but the passenger name recognition data, as I understand it, leaves us vulnerable to some of these countries sending us some of these foreign fighters. Can you tell us a little about that, or anybody else in the panel, how that program is working, and what else can be done to get better data on these people?
Senator, let me start. I agree with you about the concern of foreign fighters coming from countries for which we did not require a visa, which is why last year we required additional information data fields in the ESTA database, those who want to come here. And then in August of this year, we identified a number of security enhancements that we could obtain from countries in the program so that we have a much better idea of who is coming here from those countries. They include, for example, the requirement that these countries make better use of API and PNR data, that they use the Interpol database for stolen passports on a more regular basis, that we increase the use of federal air marshals on flights coming from these countries. There are a whole series of security enhancements that we identified that we could obtain and we are obtaining from these countries for exactly this reason.
And what more do you need? What more can we help you with? Is there anything legislatively we can do, or a codification of any of that, or other ways to ensure we don't have these foreign fighters slipping into this country?
Well, HSPD 6, which is a presidential directive, gives us a lot of authority in this area. And if countries want to be in this program, they should agree to these security enhancements. So that has been the mechanism for our seeking greater assurances on that. But this is a concern of mine, and I'm always asking my staff that exact question. Is there any legislative authority that we could use?
Well, let us know. And on the passenger name recognition data, my understanding is there are some concerns there. Is there more we can do to tighten that up as well? And maybe we can get back to us with a specific answer on that issue. On the Syrian refugees in general, you know, as you know, Secretary Johnson, I've spent some time focusing on this issue of special immigrant visas for interpreters who served with our troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. We've had a real hard time being able to go through the security clearance for these interpreters who had already gone through a clearance process. Mm-hmm. And so I got to tell you, I'm very skeptical of what I hear today about 10,000 Syrians coming into this country and having some sort of an expedited process to screen them, having gone through the experience of these interpreters. So I guess I would ask you today, and Director Comey also, you've expressed concerns about this as well, I've noted in the public media. How are we going to deal with this? 1,600 Syrians by the end of fiscal year 2015 are going to be admitted. Don't you think that also creates a threat to the homeland? And you know, if you do think that, from your, again, the comments that I've seen in the public media, you have a concern about that, what are we going to do about it?
Well, yes, Senator. I mean, there is risk associated with bringing anybody in from the outside, but especially from a conflict zone like that. From the intelligence community's perspective, as I said, I think we've developed an effective way to touch all of our databases and resources to figure out what we know about individuals. Right? And so that's my piece of it. I don't think that's a cumbersome process. My concern there is that there are certain gaps that I don't want to talk about publicly in that in the data available to us. But I can't speak to the rest of the processing that may be part of what you're talking about.
Well, I think there's a significant gap because our intelligence in Syria is so bad, right? I mean, we really don't have the information that we need to be able to process these folks. And I think we need to figure this out quickly, given the fact we've made this commitment. But I don't know, Director Rasmussen, do you have more to add to that?
I mean, you've certainly highlighted that as a matter of comparison, the intelligence picture we have of this particular conflict zone is not as rich as we would like it to be. So that would give us, obviously, when you screen and vet, you screen and vet against available intelligence holdings. The more you have, the more likely you are to be able to catch derogatory information that would cause you to review a potential case more closely. So I think the director is absolutely right. We've got a much more streamlined and effective system to make sure that all of our intelligence holdings are brought to bear as these decisions are made, but you can only review against what you have, and again, we are actually building that fact into the way our analysts look at the picture as well, so that at least we can identify where more questions need to be asked, even if intelligence isn't available.
Well, my time's expired. I appreciate it, Mr. Chairman, but I think this is a huge issue. And before making these commitments, I hope that there were some dialogue with certainly you three gentlemen and your organizations, and I hope that we can come up with a screening process that's better than the one we've had on these interpreters I talked about, and particularly with even less intelligence, as you say, from the ground. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Langford.
Gentlemen, thank you for your work to protect the nation. It's extremely important. And I want you to hear from the folks in Oklahoma. We appreciate the work that you do, and it's incredibly valuable. We understand very well, as Jay Johnson was in Oklahoma not long ago, Director Comey was in Oklahoma not long ago. We understand extremely well the threats that we face. And so I just want you to hear from us again that we're grateful for what you're doing. I want to ask you, Secretary Johnson, you mentioned before about the cybersecurity bill. Can you explain to this committee the why on the cybersecurity bill, why that is so important right now? Not the threats that are out there, but the specific language and what you need on the cybersecurity bill.
Yes, sir. Two principal things come to mind immediately. One, explicit congressional authorization for DHS's ability to monitor, identify, and block unwanted intrusions in other federal agencies through our Einstein system. The virtue of the Einstein system, and it has the ability to block intrusions, and it is a platform for greater and better technology in the future.
And that's into federal systems, not private systems, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Number two, greater incentives through law for the private sector to share information with the federal government when it comes to cyber threat indicators. And so that is something that is in the pending legislation now before the Senate, and I think that's a very good thing. So those are the two principal areas. There's always the data breach notification requirement and enhanced penalties, but those are the two principal things we need.
Voluntary cooperation or mandatory cooperation with the private sector?
We believe that encouraging voluntary cooperation with the private sector is the way to go.
Okay. That's a key aspect. I would agree on that. And I think the private sector and that cooperation, as Jim Comey mentioned earlier, FBI doesn't come from Mars. We're all American citizens here. It's finding ways for us to be able to work together on this, I think, is extremely important. I want us to be able to shift a little bit to what some other folks have talked about. We talk about the threat from ISIS. It's spectacular. And we talk about couple of dozen folks that are here that are major concerns that are here. Last year we had over 10,000 deaths by heroin on the streets of the United States. Hotel rooms, houses, on the streets, homes, people quietly dying from heroin and from narco-terrorists moving into our borders and distributing this incredibly toxic substance across our nation. So whether it's heroin, whether it's cocaine, whether it's marijuana, whether it's methamphetamines, it's a very strategic move that's happening, and it's extremely aggressive and seems to be accelerating at a pace we haven't seen before in many areas of certain types. We seem to have new locations that these drugs are coming from as well. So can you help me understand the coordinated strategy, not only dealing with ISIS and those threats on American soil, but the threats that are coming in from narco-terrorists around the world as well, both their distribution networks, the interdiction, and if we're dealing with new locations and new groups to bring it in. How are we coordinating that among the agencies to take that on?
You want to start?
Yes, sir. Senator, I can start from the enforcement perspective. Your description is completely accurate, and I actually worry that our country's not getting it the way you described it. I recently, the acting administrator of the DEA, who is a great leader, sent over his team to brief me on their current view of the threat, and it is breathtaking. Right? Cocaine use has gone down since 2006. That's good news. All the rest is not just bad news, it's awful.
Right.
Right? And so the strategy from the enforcement perspective is try to disrupt the traffickers, right? Try to lock them up, both the kingpins in Mexico, which is where this is coming from, and to disrupt the gangs and organized criminals they're using to distribute it in the United States. The goal being to try to drive up the price, to be honest. What's happening is heroin is so cheap and so pure that it's a tidal wave washing over children and killing them because they don't know how pure it is. And so that's the strategy from the law enforcement perspective. Drive up the cost by locking up as many of these people as we can. And I can't speak to, obviously, the international piece as well as maybe others could.
Senator, on the interdiction front, I think the key is a good working relationship with the government of Mexico. My department and I personally spend a lot of time with my Mexican counterparts. I plan to go there next week. This will be a topic. We have our joint task forces here, but working with the government of Mexico is obviously key, and I agree with you that we need to do a better job in this respect because the problem is getting worse.
Yeah, it's accelerating. We seem to have supply coming from new areas as well. Are you seeing new players internationally that are trying to actually get supply to the United States? Mm-hmm. I mean, Mexico is obviously a very close neighbor. They're pushing all the way through North America, all the way to Canada. Are there other locations that you've seen on the horizon that you would say this is a new region that we haven't dealt with as much, but they're trying to transport to the United States?
The big focus is Mexico, because what's happened is the Mexican traffickers have figured out that they can do better by, instead of bringing Colombian heroin or heroin from some other place in the United States and transport to the United States, they're growing it in southern Mexico. They're growing the poppies, they're refining it themselves. So it's just a business. They just shorten their transportation routes. They've dropped their cost so they can sell it at a lower cost and a higher purity. And so it's that domination. And then the other piece, which is a plague in the West, is methamphetamine. Right? They're making it in huge factories in Mexico. Again, they're not bringing it in from Colombia or any other place anymore. So that the center, ground zero for this plague on across the drugs is Mexico.
Let me give you a little bit of good news.
Okay.
The United States Coast Guard. We sent the national security cutter, the USS Stratton, on a 4-month mission down to Central America. While they were out for 4 months, they interdicted $1 billion worth of cocaine, including large seizures off of submersibles that the cartels manufacture and run in the high seas between South America and Central America. So we want to continue those kinds of missions.
Okay, what is needed to be able to continue that kind of interdiction? Because, as has already been mentioned, it's not coming from Central America. They'll produce it in Mexico, and so trying to find those locations. Methamphetamine production, I believe, is going down in the United States, but it's rising rapidly in Mexico. So we have found effective ways to be able to limit the production in the United States, but now it's just being pushed out. So how are we handling trying to limit production there and to be able to work through the process? As you mentioned, visiting with your Mexican counterparts is a good step, but the fields continue to grow that are there, both with poppies and with marijuana and the production, the locations to be able to pick up the basic supplies, to be able to do methamphetamine and the international connections for those. how can we help?
Greater coordinated law enforcement between our two governments. That's the key. And we do that on a regular basis, but we need to do more.
Okay, thank you for where your work is on that. I would tell you keep your eye on the ball on that because that is something that we deal with on our streets across the entire country all the time. You all know that very well. The focus can't be off, obviously, international terrorism, what's happening with ISIL and their plans and their intentional focus to try to penetrate the United States. But we know the narco-terrorists are penetrating us every single day, and to be able to find a way to be able to go through that. One other quick side note, if I can, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Johnson, your department's been very good working with the state of Oklahoma and dealing with the Real ID. We're trying to work through all the final details. You've been good on a waiver on that with us. We are addressing that as a state, and I appreciate your waiver for us as we try to work through the final process to get up to speed on it. So appreciate that.
Thank you. The thing I'd emphasize there is that we're progressing in our efforts to enforce this law, and there will come a point where we have to set some real deadlines. So I'm pleased at the progress that we've been making and working with state officials in Oklahoma.
It's been good. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Langford. Director Rasmussen, in your previous testimony, you talked about the fact that we've taken a number of these terrorists off the map. And I guess I want to get your assessment of, the unfortunate reality is you take them off the map and they're replaced. Both leadership as well as the flow of foreign fighters seems to continue largely unabated. Can you just give me your sense of how effective the people we're killing are being replaced?
I'll do the best I can in open testimony, Senator, Mr. Chairman. I mean, one of the ways we look at this as an intelligence community is try to identify who brings unique capability to the terrorist enterprise, whether that's from a leadership level, a high-value leadership target, someone who may have a very specific set of skills, perhaps in the weapons of mass destruction field or use of explosives, someone who has shown ability to organize and orchestrate significant large-scale plotting activities. Those kinds of individuals would be worthy of focused intelligence collection and whatever disruption capabilities we can bring to bear. I probably want to leave it there. Now that is an ongoing.
What about the flow of foreign fighters?
The flow of foreign fighters. There is nobody who is satisfied that we have yet turned the tide in terms of getting that flow to have crested. I will say, though, if there is a good news story somewhere embedded in this foreign fighter story, it is that the level of information sharing that some of which Secretary Johnson was talking about a few minutes ago, particularly with our European partners, is much more robust than it would have been if we had entered, at the point we entered this crisis 2 years ago.
The purpose of this hearing is laying out the reality, and so the reality is we haven't stemmed the flow the way we want to. Talk about a little bit about the significance of the caliphate in the territory. I mean, there was an excellent article written by Graham Wood that really was pretty eye-opening. I think for many people in Washington, we talked about that, Director Comey. Can you talk about that significance, again, lay out that reality, and why part of our strategy has to be to deny them that territory to really end this caliphate?
And there's a couple of different features of the ISIL's declaration of the caliphate that make it particularly concerning. One is as you yourself suggested, Mr. Chairman, it becomes almost a magnet to attract individuals who are seeking meaning, who are seeking to participate in a global jihadist enterprise. And that is unlike al-Qaeda, who was often running their enterprise as a clandestine movement with a very, very rigorous vetting process before allowing individuals inside the fold. ISIL is issuing an open invitation on social media for people to come to the caliphate and join. So simply in terms of size and scale, the declaration of the caliphate gives us concern because it provides that magnet. But beyond that kind of somewhat amorphous effect, the creation of a caliphate and the control of physical space, as I mentioned in my testimony, gives a terrorist organization the opportunity to gather resources, to operate potentially in a safe haven environment. And while they are managing other priorities, it gives them the time and space to pursue more aggressive, ambitious external operations. Again, maybe of the sort even that al-Qaeda did traditionally. So that is, I guess what I would say, the part of the caliphate that gives me the greatest concern is that physical space in Iraq and Syria that you yourself pointed to with your question.
So the goal of our strategy, with that in mind, really needs to be to deny them that territory. I mean, if you're going to degrade and ultimately defeat ISIS, you got to deny them that territory.
I would agree, Senator.
Director Comey, just a quick suggestion. I did meet with this young Yazidi woman, Bazi, who's had the courage to come forward and tell her story in terms of combating on social media, these young women who are actually inspired to go to Syria and Iraq to join ISIS. That'd be a pretty powerful way of doing it, just a comment. Secretary Johnson, we've held 8 hearings on border security now. We're going to hold our 9th. In a couple of weeks, we'll issue the majority report on our conclusions from those hearings. I think we're in agreement that, because we've talked about this repeatedly, I'm a manufacturer, I'm always looking for the root cause. And I think we agree, Senator Carper, that the root cause of our unsecured border is literally our insatiable demand for drugs. And it's been insatiable for decades, which has given rise to the drug cartels who are beginning to combine with transnational criminal organizations, potentially terrorist organizations. And so that's what we need to address. It's one of the reasons I pointed out the fact that General McCaffrey said we're only interdicting 5 to 10% of the drugs coming to the southern border, which shows you how unsecure our border is. So again, we have to lay out that ugly and harsh reality. I'd like to give you, Secretary Johnson, the opportunity. You've talked about the strategy that you're trying to employ, that you'd want this Congress, and quite honestly, a lot of this would come through this committee to help you codify. So can you just describe what your strategy is in kind of summary detail here? And again, I am completely committed to work very closely with you and your department to codify this in a step-by-step approach, which is, I think, the way we can actually accomplish it. Let's find the areas of agreement that unite us. But can you kind of lay that out and give me the priorities of the components? Again, we started with you need information to solve a problem. So the border security metrics bill, we're going to try and move that and get that passed and on the President's desk as soon as possible. But then what are the next steps? And what is your strategy?
In terms of pure border security, Senator, more technology, more surveillance to pursue a risk-based strategy so that we go after the threats where they know they exist. More surveillance, more technology, which was reflected in our FY16 budget submission. We need help in terms of speeding the process of deportations and asylum applications in immigration courts, more resources to accomplish that so that the time it takes to litigate is not as long as it is. But frankly, given you mentioned the root causes in this country, I want to mention the root causes that exist in Central America. Last time I was on the border, I talked to a 7-year-old girl who came all the way from Central America all by herself to Texas. And more surveillance is not going to deter a 7-year-old who's fleeing poverty and violence in Central America from coming up here. So my judgment is that we have to address the underlying causes in those countries. We talk about addressing the underlying causes for refugees in Syria. We've got to do the same in Central America as well. And so the administration's asked for $1 billion to invest in Central America, and I hope the Congress seriously considers that. As long as the conditions in those countries are as bad as they are, we are going to have the types of numbers that we have coming from Central America. And so I want to invest in a smart, efficient border strategy, which includes surveillance and technology on our border, but we've got to address the underlying causes too.
But if we do survey and detect, and we apprehend, and we process, and then we distribute and disperse around America, that sends a pretty powerful signal to Central America, if you get in America, regardless of what our laws say, if you get in America and we don't send people home, that's going to increase the flow. I mean, it's the problem right now with Syria, and we just had the President of Germany in. The more Europe accepts of the refugees from the compassion that we are as people to address that humanitarian crisis, the more they accept in, the more of the 4 million that are displaced outside will flow into Europe. The more of the 7.6 million displaced within Syria will become refugees and flow into Europe. So we have a capacity in our countries to take people. You know, we're a nation of immigrants, but at the same time we have to recognize what incentives are we creating for illegal immigration. We also have to assess, and we're going to be going down to Central America, are there governing structures? Are there leaders, like we had in Colombia? Are there leaders that will actually take that money and use it properly to improve conditions, or are we just basically wasting that money as well? Those are legitimate questions, but I think we really do have to address as part of our border security strategy, again, assessing the fact of our insatiable demand for drugs, also look at every incentive that we have created within our law for illegal immigration. We've talked about this. The number one is work. So let's have a functioning guest worker program. So there's a host of issues, but I really, you know, we can control things here. I don't know how much we can control in Central America. We're compassionate. We want to help, and that'd be great. I'm not sure how much we can do, but we can do things here, and so let's make sure we're addressing all those incentives within our law, within our adjudication process, that are incentivizing people to come into this country and end those incentives.
I don't disagree with what you're saying, but I do believe, having spent my 22 months as Secretary of Homeland Security intensely focused on this problem, that a large part of the solution is addressing the conditions in Central America. It's
now again,
reality, not simply as a matter of compassion.
If we can make those economically prosperous zones, you know, not havens for drugs and corruption, I'd agree with you. I'm not sure we can. Short term, there's some things we can do short term inside this country ourselves. Senator Carper.
As our chairman's heard me say, and I think you, Mr. Secretary, have heard me say many times, find out what works, do more of that. And if we go back and look at Colombia, 20 years ago, failed nation, Plan Colombia, which we supported, funded, they had good leadership. They had a lot of leadership from the private sector as well. And bit by bit, they've turned things around there. So somebody's done this before. We were involved in that, and so were other folks. And I would say, with respect to Central America and the movement of all these folks up to our country, especially last year, not as much this year, but there is a root cause, and you've nailed it, Mr. Secretary. But what the chairman says, there's a lot of wisdom in that as well. And it's not a choice of doing one or the other. Actually, we need to do both. And the question is, can we walk and chew gum at the same time? I think we can, and I think we must. Nick, I've taken it easy on you today, and I'm going to get you into the game here for a little bit. Does the name Jessica Stern mean anything to you?
Yes, sir. She's a terrorism expert, I think, who in the academic world right now, but she has former government service. Come across
and her husband does too. Her husband, Chet Atkins, was a former colleague of several of us in the House of Representatives for a number of years. And I had the good fortune, she was actually testified here, I think at our hearing on Jihad 2.0 earlier, and I had a chance to meet with her and her husband a couple of months ago, and she was good enough to give me a couple of her books, one called ISIS, State of Terror, and that's a recent book, and then another one that she'd written, gosh, more than a decade ago. And her book focused, the older book focused on what is it that's causing estranged, alienated men, largely, to create in this country faith-based organizations in many cases that are really designed, that are morphing into terror organizations. And she grew that into visits all over the world, Palestine, if you will, Afghanistan, Iraq, all kinds of places. And what she was trying to do is drill down on root causes. What is it that's causing these, mostly guys, to leave their countries and go off, in many cases, and go off and form an outfit or join an outfit like ISIS. And what she concluded is this. She said, these are mostly men without much meaning in their life. These are people who are, they don't like, in this country, they think of us as a great Satan, a lot of immorality, the prospect of adventure, of real meaning in their life, the prospect of when they die, they go to heaven. Before they die, they have all these wives. And for people, there's not much happening in their life. There's not much prospect. She said, hey, they're ripe for the plucking. Did she have it right there? And, you know, again, thinking about root causes, part of the root cause is why are these people willing to come from all over the world and to join up with ISIS?
Thank you, Senator. And she certainly has part of it right. And the words you're using on her behalf or as part of her academic work echo some of the same analysis that our analysts across the community are engaged in. But I would, and this, I meant to add this when one of your colleagues on the committee asked earlier about underlying conditions or underlying causes. if you look at each and every one of the conflict zones around the world that are particularly fraught right now, or where ISIL seems to be able to take hold in some form or fashion, another recurring theme that runs through it is sectarian conflict. And so when there are in those locations significant unresolved sectarian issues, and I don't need to go into the details on how that plays out in Iraq and Syria and across the Levant between the Sunni and Shia communities, that just creates a much more fertile ground for the ISIL narrative to take hold. And so that, as you consider mitigating strategies, that adds a layer of complexity to what you're trying to do, because you're not simply setting up a condition where you're good against evil or good guys against bad guys. If your terrorist population of concern is also enmeshed in a sectarian conflict in which the answers are not easy, or if they were easy, they would have been seized upon by previous Iraqi and Syrian governments. All I'm saying is that adds a layer of complexity to a somewhat more simple narrative of personal alienation. And again, I'm not saying simple in a derogatory way. That's just one level of the problem.
And so, it seems that a number of the people that are coming are going to join in the fight with ISIS. Some of them are coming from, they don't have much in terms of earning power. They don't have a lot of money in their lives. And one of the things that I hear may attract them is being paid to get some money out of this. And they, could you just take a minute and give us an unclassified assessment of ISIS's finances? Are they running a deficit? Are they having trouble paying their bills? What are some of the factors? How do these factors impact their ability to be successful?
That's a very good question. At a gross aggregate level, we believe ISIS is a well-financed, well-resourced organization right now. At the early stages of the conflict, we assessed that some of the resource base in which they were relying was not necessarily going to be replenishable or a recurring base. You can rob a bank or the central bank in Iraq once, but you can't rob it again and again and again. So I think we had hoped that over time, ISIL's ability to generate additional resources would go down more dramatically than it has. What they have shown is an ability present in the territory they control, principally oil, and exploit that for financial gain, and actually develop their own manufacturing capability, and in a sense, run an organization like a state. And so I think, unlike the al-Qaeda financial picture, which we were dealing with for a number of years, where you were worried about specific fundraising activities in certain far-flung capitals around the world and money flowing to Pakistan to fund terrorist activity, this is much more self-generation by ISIL as it functions like a state, including using taxation, but also extortion, also criminal means as well.
All right, thanks. One last quick question, if I could, Mr. Chairman, and this is one for Secretary Johnson. I understand you've established a new Office of Violent Extremism, and could you just take a moment and share with us how this office will do things maybe differently from DHS's existing efforts to counter violent extremism, please?
A couple of things. One, this office and this director will report directly to me. Two, I'm consolidating all the personnel within the department in headquarters who work on CVE in that one office under the supervision of that one director. And three, we want to eventually use this office to extend its reach out into the field so that we have more reach in the field, because when you embed people in the communities, you get some good results. And I want this office to focus on taking our efforts along with the FBI and other agencies to the next level, which is giving the counter message a larger platform and encouraging leaders in those communities along with the tech sector to get together and do that, encourage philanthropies, and develop some of our own grant making in this specific area.
Thank you. Our thanks to each one of you. Thank you.
Senator Baldwin.
It's pretty good timing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. I want to thank all three of you for your service. And I was here for your testimony. As you know, I had to step out. And so at the risk of getting into some of the territory that's been covered in my absence. I apologize for that. But I wanted to dovetail on some of the questions that Senator Carper asked in his first round relating to the Syrian refugee crisis, and in particular, a number of you testified that we are getting better at the vetting process over time, but we're not error-proof, 100% error-proof yet. And there was also, I think Chairman Johnson talked a little bit about prioritization in terms of family members of Syrian Americans, et cetera. I guess in this public setting, I'm wondering if you can outline for me how we make this process more efficient and swift without sacrificing the thoroughness and quality. And if you can talk a little bit, Secretary Johnson, about the prioritization process to the degree that exists that deal with family members. I mean, I would assume that the vetting for a child is different than a vetting for an adult and other ties to the United States. Recognizing that we are currently in a public setting, please tell me as much as you can in this setting.
Yes. There are several agencies involved in the process, USCIS, State Department, and when a refugee is referred to us, they are referred to us by UNHCR. So UNHCR will have done some of its own vetting, not necessarily the security vetting that we would conduct. And in referring a refugee to the United States in particular, it's my understanding they do so because there are family connections to the United States versus some other country. So by the time they come to us, UNHCR has adjudged them to be a good candidate for resettlement in the United States. Once they're with us, the State Department meets with the individual. My understanding is that somebody from USCIS will personally interview the refugee. There's a pretty extensive background check now that includes vetting against a lot of other databases and agencies, including law enforcement and intelligence. It's better than it used to be. And the good news here is that UNHCR has already identified a number of refugees that they believe would be appropriate for resettlement in the United States. So we're not starting from scratch, where we're waiting for people to pick up and leave Syria. UNHCR has already identified a number that are suitable for resettlement in the United States, and that's where we start. There was a reference made to 1,600 resettled this year. I think we will finish out this fiscal year, the last fiscal year, at around closer to around 2,000. So we will have gotten through the ones that we were focused on in fiscal 15. But I do want to be, and I've told our people we should be, very careful in the security reviews for each of these. I agree with the assessments that have been expressed here earlier that this is a population of people that we're not going to know a whole lot about necessarily coming from Syria. So we're going to meet our commitments with the resources we have, but we will do so carefully.
Thank you. Mr. Rasmussen, you talked in your testimony, in your written testimony, you described the increasing competition and conflict between the Taliban, ISIL, and al-Qaeda as a dynamic that you are working to understand more thoroughly. You also mentioned that the conflicts between these groups may in some respect distract from their Western targets. I would like to hear from you sort of what are the questions that you're asking. You said you don't have all the answers. What are the questions that you're asking? And in some ways, I've always worried that conflict between these groups could lead to a competition to be more spectacular than, than each other, and that, of course, gives us great concern.
The conflict plays out at a number of levels. First of all, there's kind of at an ideological level, conflict and competition taking place between al-Qaeda and the affiliated groups that still remain affiliated to al-Qaeda in Yemen, al-Shabaab in Somalia, for example, other al-Qaeda affiliated organizations, competition between them and ISIL for preeminence in the marketplace of ideas among global extremists. So that's at a very at a high altitude. But on the ground in certain locations, there's much more on-the-ground physical conflict between ISIL or ISIL-related groups with the Taliban in Afghanistan, for example, where actually there you have individuals who in other circumstances might even be comrades in arms, but in this circumstance are actually engaged in fighting and killing each other on the battlefield, even as Afghan national security forces and U.S. coalition forces are also present in the theater as well. So I take your point that you certainly don't want to create a competition for ever greater levels of spectacular violence. But the one thing that internal conflict, particularly that conflict on the battlefield in a place like Afghanistan does, is it does tend to be pretty all-consuming for a terrorist organization to fight a ground war against other extremist adversaries in a place like Afghanistan. So we're watching very carefully to see if the ISIL province in Afghanistan turns its attention from that effort to gain on the ground against the Taliban, turns from that project to something that would be aimed at us, particularly something with an external focus, something looking at the West akin to al-Qaeda over the last dozen years. So I don't necessarily want to call it good news or that we are heartened, but that what we do as a matter of assessment is realize that terrorist organizations often have finite capabilities, and so they don't necessarily have the ability to prioritize everything equally. The more they are engaged in that kind of effort on the ground that is often very resource intensive, the less capacity they have to carry out the more kind of complex plotting.
In your verbal testimony this morning, you talked about sort of ISIL having overtaken al-Qaeda, and you pointed to access to resources and territorial control and control over basically more people. Is there still a very sharp distinction between ISIL and al-Qaeda with regard to their aspirations to control territory? And how does that relate to the risk that the organizations pose to our homeland?
From al-Qaeda's perspective, ISIL's declaration of the caliphate is illegitimate and premature. And so they differ fundamentally on a central premise of what the ISIL agenda. At the same time, I wouldn't draw some huge distinction between the two groups as they look at the legitimacy or virtue of attacking the West in whatever way that they can find the capacity to do so. So now they are not making common cause with each other in that effort because of the philosophical and leadership cleavages. But at the same time, we worry and watch for individuals who might migrate across organizational lines to cooperate with each other for specific purpose-driven efforts. Just because someone is ISIL or al-Qaeda one day does not mean that that is your laminated badge from the organization may not last very long. You may find yourself changing teams, changing sides, and that's why I say what I said in the testimony about the ISIL gaining preeminence. Success breeds success, and more individuals have flowed in the direction of ISIL for that reason.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I note that I have exceeded my time already. I have one other question that I wanted to hear from the witnesses. I would ask unanimous consent to submit it for the record.
That's fine, and we'll keep the record open for questions for the record, so thanks, Senator Baldwin. It is another tradition of this committee, at least since Senator Carper was chairman, was to give the witnesses a chance to just make kind of a closing comment, things that you'd want to remark after the questioning. So I'll start with you, Director Comey.
I don't think I have anything. I think we've covered a complex set of topics in a pretty good way. So I'm not sitting here thinking there's something lingering.
Good, I appreciate that. Secretary Johnson.
Chairman, Senator Carper, I have appreciated our very constructive working relationship. I appreciate the tone that you set at these hearings, and I appreciate your friendship.
Director Rasmussen.
The only thing
You
I
can
would
have more time. If you,
The only thing I would
Sing our
add,
praises.
Mr. Chairman, is on the governmental affairs side of your committee's hat, I think you would be pleased, I think as Senator Carper said, with how well and how closely our organizations are working together. As many of you know, NCTC is an organization that relies on contributions from other organizations. Our lifeblood, in addition to our permanent employees, is found in the contributions of other organizations. And just a couple of weeks ago, I had the opportunity to host Director Comey as he spoke to 60 or so FBI detailees assigned to NCTC who are doing terrific work on behalf of us all. So just to say, there's always room for improvement in the way we work together. We're constantly striving to get better at what we do, but I'm tremendously proud of my workforce, but also the workforces that I get support from at DHS and FBI.
Well, thank you, Director. You know, we talked earlier about, the cooperation between your agencies and state and local governments as well, and I'm sure Senator Baldwin would agree with me as I talk to individuals in Wisconsin tasked with your mission, keeping Wisconsin, but also this nation safe. They also are very pleased with the cooperation. So this is, we're moving in the right direction. That's kind of good news. So I appreciate that. Again, I want to thank you for your service to this nation, all three of you. I think America is incredibly fortunate to have men of your caliber and of your dedication, of your integrity, serving in your capacity. I realize this is not a 9-to-5 job, 5 days a week. This is 24/7, 365 days a year, and all three of you are working hard to keep this nation safe. So truly, I think I speak for all of us when I thank you for your patriotism and for your service to this nation.
I'm Tom Carper, and I approve this message.
That message. Again, there's an awful lot we agree on, and we're trying to find those areas that unify us. So this hearing record will remain open for 15 days until October 23rd at 5 p.m., so you got some time, Senator Baldwin. For submission of statements and questions for the record, this hearing is adjourned. Thank you all.
I'm the leading state sponsor of terrorism.